Alright, this video is about imperialism, but in the last lesson we talked about different kinds of imperialism, the colonies, protectorates, economic imperialism, and spheres of influence. This is just going to be about specific colonies that were conquered by Europeans during this time. The first one is Africa, colonization in Africa. Now, Africa was desired by Europeans for its large amounts of resources, especially rubber, oil, coal, iron, and diamonds. Now, Europeans had been conquering some port cities along the coast of Africa during slave trade, but they started to get to the inland too and found even vaster amounts of resources. And so the Europeans actually start fighting over Africa. And eventually, after a lot of fighting happens, the Europeans are like, well, maybe let's not fight anymore. So they hold something called the Berlin Conference. And this is basically where they decide to divide up Africa. And when they did this, European divided up Africa. And here are all the tribal boundaries in Africa. And here are the European colonies as it's divided up. And they basically just divided up according to what the Europeans wanted. They didn't take into account the tribal boundaries. And this is really important because to Europeans, this helps them because they can sort of divide and conquer with using these tribes against each other. But also it keeps the tribes from uniting to have an uprising against the Europeans' control. And there are a few examples that you need to know about. One of them is South Africa. South Africa was a British settler colony. Algeria was a French settler colony. This is where the British and the French are actually going there to sending massive amounts of people there to live permanently. But the Congo Free State is probably the best example of direct control. And this is when King Leopold, and here you kind of see King Leopold down here, of Belgium, he takes over and he calls the Congo the Free State. This is how he convinces the people of the Berlin Conference to give him the Congo. And he wants rubber from the Congo. But when he gets there, even though he's calling it the Congo Free State, he says he's going to treat them with Enlightenment principles, but he actually treated them pretty terribly. And here you can kind of see this political cartoon of this African being strangled by King Leopold. And there's an estimated 15 million people that were died or mutilated by King Leopold because he basically set up quotas. If you don't get this many resources for me, I'm going to kill you. Or another big habit of King Leopold is ordering the mutilation of people. A lot of times he would cut off their hands and say, if you don't work and get this much for me, you're going to lose your hands. So that happened quite a lot. So that's a good example of direct control. The British, actually, even though we have this example of the settler colony, the British usually used indirect control in Africa. They also used indirect control in India. And so colonization in India, some of the resources that the Europeans wanted were cotton, opium, which is going to become very important when we get to China. And opium is sort of a drug that you can get to get high. Tea, sugar, silk, and jute. Jute was used to make rope. So this started out, the British East India Company was trading with the Mughal Empire. The British East India Company actually conquered some of the cities. And they were competing with the French. But the British East India Company was a business, and they were competing with the country of France. And so they defeated the country of France to establish complete control. So they had basically a sphere of influence. India was only allowed to trade with Britain at the time. But then the British East India Company goes on to defeat the entire Mughal Empire, who was already struggling a little bit with rebellions from the Sikhs and the Marathas. But the British East India Company conquers all of the Mughal Empire with the help of sepoys. The sepoys were Hindus who didn't like being ruled by Muslims, so they helped the British, just kind of going along with divide and conquer, helped the British take over. Now, eventually, the British East India Company doesn't respect the sepoys. The sepoys have a rebellion, and the British government has to step in. They come in, put down the rebellion, and they step in and take control, making India an official colony of Great Britain. And they're going to use or indirect rule. They're going to use local Indians to help them govern. And this is very true of the Raj. Here you can see some local Indians that are participating in the government. The Pacific and the Pacific Islands were also conquered at that time, especially Australia and New Zealand, both conquered by the British. Now, Australia originally was used as a place to send prisoners, so they would sort of exile their prisoners to Australia, and that's where they had to live as punishment. It's a very dry, hot climate. But eventually, as more and more people started going there, it became a settler colony, and most of the settlers raised livestock and cattle that could be shipped back to Europe for meat. But the Aborigines there, the local natives that were there in Australia, their land was slowly taken from them. Some of them assimilated into the European population. They sort of adopted European culture, but most of them, they just died out and their land was taken from them. Eventually, after the Aborigines slowly die out or kind of leave because of their culture, this settler colony comes up with something called the White Australia policy. They didn't want to let anybody in but white people to try to keep this a sort of to keep their culture alive in the settler colony. Indonesia was also conquered. These islands here, colonized by the Dutch East India Company. So again, we have a business conquering these places for spices. And so that is it for colonization.
May I have your attention, please, Mr. Schaffner? If you